Hey everyone, my name is Jeremy McPeak for NetTuts, and welcome to ASP.NET from scratch. Today we are going to continue with the MVC framework and look at controllers, which is the C in MVC. Now in the traditional MVC pattern, the controller is responsible for the application level logic, and that is user input and output, as well as getting and modifying the model, and just anything else that is handled at the application level. Well, in the MVC framework, the controller pretty much does those things. It handles user input, and as far as a web application is concerned, a user supplies input by making a request. So a GET request or a POST request from a form, just any type of request can be considered input from the user. So in the previous lesson, we saw how requests are routed to methods on a controller. So the controller is actually handling that type of input. And then it takes that input and it does something, either using the model to get information or change any type of information within the model, or just something else that the application itself needs to do. And then it passes any type of data to the view, and then that view is then returned to the user, which is the output. So it handles everything that's necessary at the application level of our web application. In our code, controllers are nothing more than classes. If we open up the project from the previous two lessons and open up Home Controller, we can see that we have a Home Controller class that inherits from controller. Home Controller has three methods. It has an index method. It also has a contact method. This one renders the contact form to the user, and then this contact method does something with the data whenever the user posts that form. Now, in order to have a valid controller class, we don't actually have to inherit from controller. In fact, all we really have to do is implement this iController interface, which specifies this execute method. So we could actually go into Home Controller, change it to implement only iController, and we would have a valid controller. Of course, we would also have to implement the execute method because that's not done here, but this would be a valid controller. But in doing so, we lose a lot of functionality because the controller class inherits from controller base, which implements iController, so that's already done for us. Controller base provides us with some helper methods, but we get quite a few helper methods from the controller class. As you can see, we get request data and response data. We also get some methods to send different types of data back to the user. So we can send just plain content. We can also send a file, which would be in a byte array or a stream, or we can provide it a path to a file on the file system and send that file to the HTTP response stream. We can also send JavaScript with this JavaScript method that is sending actual JavaScript to be executed on the client. We have a JSON method which we can send an object to, and it will serialize that into a JSON structure. We have just quite a few methods that we can use that help us in writing code, basically. So we do have the ability to write our own controller classes if we want to, if we need different functionality. The MVC framework provides us the tools to allow us to do that. But for the most part, we just want to inherit from this controller class because it provides us with just about everything else that we would need. Okay, so let's go back to our Home Controller, and we are going to look at the contact action method that handles post requests. As it is right now, this is not very safe. We're not doing any type of data validation, and we don't even really know if the data that's being passed as this contact message object actually contains information that we can use, and there could be some errors when the model binder tried to create this object for us. So we need to add some intelligence to this method in order to handle different types of situations. The first thing we want to do is ensure that the model binder did not encounter any errors when binding data to this object here, this contact message object. So we do that with an object called model state, and it has a property called isValid. And of course, if it's true, then we want to run all of this wonderful code. But if not, then we actually want to let the user see that there was some type of invalid data that they put in. So we are going to return the view, and we are also going to pass the message object. So we are sending strongly typed data to our view, and we will modify our view accordingly. Now, this is valid is a little bit misleading because it kind of makes you think that it's performing validation for you. Well, the only type of validation that it really does is to make sure that the information that the user types into the form matches the types of data for our model, in this case this contact message. Now, we really aren't going to see any type of errors right now because all of the properties for our contact message object are strings, and everything can be converted into a string, so we're not going to see any type of error. But if we change this to a Boolean, this email, and we need to go back here and just make this a string in order to make this work, we will see an error if we type in something other than true or false into the email text box, because the model binder is going to take that value in that text box and try to bind it to this property. And since if it's anything other than true or false, that cannot be converted to true and false, so an error is going to occur. So if we were actually going to run this, and I'm going to put a breakpoint here so we can actually see what the value of isValid is. We'll run this, we'll go to our form, and we'll fill it out normally. But we will also see that we have invalid data as far as the model binder is concerned. So let's just put in our name, let's put in an email, really doesn't matter, and when we submit the form, we're going to see that isValid is false. If we look at our message object though, let's see, everything else is fine. Message body is there, name is there, but email is false. So since isValid is false, none of this is going to execute, and instead it's going to go down here. So we'll just continue on, and we see, or it looks like that nothing really happened, but we returned the view and we returned the view data. But if we look at the source code, then we can see that we have a new CSS class here, this input-validation-error. This is the MVC framework doing this for us. It knows that there is an error for this field as far as the data is concerned. So we can actually add a CSS class here to make this a background color of red or something, so that we can point out to the user, hey, you need to fix this information. So we can at least do a little bit of at least data type checking with this model state object and its isValid property. So let's go ahead and stop this, and let's change email back to a string because we don't want it as a Boolean value. So now let's add some validation to our model, which is this contact message class. We can add some validation so that whenever the model binder is setting data to an object of this class, that we can validate that information as it's being bound. So in order to do this, the first thing we need to do is implement an interface called iDataErrorInfo, and this is in the system.componentModel namespace. So we will add that namespace, and then we will implement this interface. There are two properties or two items here. The first is a property for named error. It is a string, and then there is an indexer. And since this is an indexer, we need to have something to index. So we are going to have a private dictionary, and it's going to have a string key, which is going to be the name of our properties here, and then it's going to have a string value to contain the error message. We're going to call this _errors, and then we will create that object. Now, what we need to do is kind of do this old school. This get and set shorthand properties aren't going to be sufficient. We are actually going to have a private field and then use these properties to access those private fields. So the first thing we will do is this private string, we're going to call it underscore name, and we don't really need to assign it a value. And then for our name property, the get is simply just going to return the name, or the underscore name. And then for set, we're going to do something different. We need to make sure that this value is an actual value. We don't want the user to leave that text box for the name blank. So we want to make sure that it is not null or empty or null or white space. So I'm actually going to write a function to do that for us. So let's write that function first. Func string, and then it's going to return a Boolean value. We'll call this is valid input, and our Lambda expression is going to check string.is null or empty. We want to make sure that it is not null or empty, so we use the not operator on that. We also want to make sure that it is not a null or white space, so we want actual data here. So that's what this function is doing. It is accepting a string argument and it's returning Boolean. It is using that string parameter in the is null or empty or is null or white space static methods, and it's returning true or false based upon if that's actual valid data. So we need to use this function is valid data, or is valid input, and we want to make sure that the value being assigned to this property is valid. If it is, then hunky-dory, we will set name as value and simply return. But if it's not, then we need to add an error message to our errors dictionary here. So we will do errors add. We want to use name for this key here, so name. There we go. And we need some type of error message. Since we are checking to make sure that is null or empty or is null or white space, then we just want to say that name cannot be empty. That will be sufficient for this. And we have essentially validated our name property. Okay, so let's validate the email now. So whenever the user types something into the email text box, then we need to make sure that, one, they have actually typed in something, and two, that they have typed a valid email address. Now we could go as far as making sure that that email address does exist, but all we really care about is if it's syntactically valid. So the first thing we need to add is another private field, string underscore email. The get of our email property needs to get that value, so we will do return underscore email. And then, of course, set is going to do something different. The first thing we want to do is call our isValidData, or I'm sorry, isValidInput. I'm going to get that right the first time one of these times. Okay, so we need to make sure that that is valid, and then we need to check the syntax of the email. So I'm going to use a regular expression to do that. And since I'm horrible with regular expressions, I have actually copied one and just pasted it in. It is cheating, but when it comes to regular expressions, I think anybody would forgive me for that. So the next thing we need is a regex object, so regex, and we need to add the system.text.regularExpressions namespace. We'll call this RE, and we'll pass in our pattern here. So now we just need to call re.isMatch, pass value, and if this is a match, then we have a valid email address, so we will set underscore email as the value, and we will return. And of course, if we get here, then that's great, but if not, then we have an error. So we need to go back to our errors, add. This is the email property, so email, and then we can do the value is not a valid email address. and that'll work for there. So now all we need to really do is validate message body, which is going to be pretty easy. Of course, we might want to sanitize that so that they could type in some JavaScript or something like that, and we could sanitize that out. I'm not going to go that far. We're just going to make sure that they did type in something, and then we need to fully implement this error and this indexer. So let's copy this. Actually, let's go up here. We're just going to cheat once again. Copy, paste, and we are going to do that. Message body, you must type a message. That'll work there. Let's get rid of this one. Okay, so for our error, we want to return whatever error is occurring here. So actually, no, we don't. We just want to let them know that there is an error. So for get, we're not going to set anything. We are going to make sure that errors count is 0. If it is 0, then we are going to return null. Otherwise, then we are going to return there were errors. And I guess we could put there were validation errors. That way we know that it is a validation problem. And so now we just need to write code for our indexer, and we get an index of column name, so we will need to use that whenever we try to get the value of whatever error has occurred. So for get here, we are going to have a string called error message. I'm not going to assign it a value because we are going to do that with this try get value method. We're going to pass in the column name, and as long as this key exists, then it is going to assign a value to our error message, and it is out, so you do have to specify out. And try get value returns a Boolean value, so if this key does exist, then try get value is going to be true, otherwise it's going to be false. So we want to return the error message if this is true, otherwise we want to return null. Alright, so we have some basic validation for our model. So when the model binder starts binding data to an object of this class, then we can perform some validation for that. So now we need to add some code to our view to use these error messages in case if some validation fails. So let's go to our view. We need to open up contact, and we have a helper method that will allow us to get the validation messages in case if one occurs. So this helper method is html.validationMessage. There are several overloads. You can see that there are 6 here. We are going to use the first one, which is the name of the property that we want to get the error message for. So this is going to be for the name text box. So we want name, and we also want to do the same thing for email, and we want to do that for our message body. Now there is another overload in case if we didn't want to use the error messages that we have specified here within our contact message class. We could actually use another overload to type in the error message. So if you wanted to just use an asterisk or something like that, you could do that. But since we went through all the trouble of writing all of this validation code and the error messages, we are just going to use these overloads here. Now, while we are in our view, let's modify it so that it knows that it is accepting a contact message object. Because if you remember, in our home controller, we are returning a contact message object to it. So it would be beneficial if we specify that here. Instead of dynamic, we could use, let's copy this, we have to use the fully qualified name here, so we'll get this namespace, type it in, or paste it in, and then type contact message. So now in our view we have a strongly typed view, and for the default values for these fields we can actually use model data. So instead of an empty string, we can use the model object, and then since it knows that our model is a contact message, we can see that from IntelliSense we are getting the properties of those types of objects. So this is name, so we want to specify name. For the email, we want to use model.email, and then for message body, we'll use model.message body. Now, since this view is expecting this type of object, and especially since we are using the model object and using names here, if we do not pass a contact message object, then we are going to get an error, because there will not be any type of value assigned for model. It will just be null. So we need to go back to home controller, and wherever we call view for contact, we need to pass a contact message object. So we have one here. We're actually going to do something different here, but for up here for this get, we need to at least create a new contact message object and pass it in, so that we can use these properties here without getting an error. Now for our post contact, whenever the model state is valid and we do create a mail message object and send it, we want to do something different. We have two scenarios to take into account. The first is when the email message is sent successfully, and then the second is when it fails for a network reason or something else. So first we want to actually redirect the user to a different view whenever the email is sent successfully. This is because if we just send them back the same view, it's going to be that posted view. If they press F5, then it's going to repost that form, or at least it's going to prompt them to repost that form. So we want to limit double postings as much as possible. So instead of returning the view, we are actually going to return a different type of action result. And we can still use the view data structure here, so that's fine, but we want to redirect to action, and then we want to specify contact. And we can see that we're getting the squiggly line, cannot implicitly convert type. Oh, we are returning a view result here. We need to just return an action result, so that will work there because we are returning a redirect to action method. And then the second scenario is when an error does occur. We want to return this same view because whatever information that they put into that form, we want to retain it. So instead of using an else here, we are going to get rid of the else, and we are just going to return the view with the message object, because if everything works fine, then we're not going to get here because we are returning here. Otherwise, if the model state is invalid, or if some type of error occurs, and we do need to change that there, then we are going to return this view with this message. So everything should run exactly as it should. So let's go ahead and run it and test it out. And let's go to home/contact. And let's first test out our other scenarios first. Hello, hi. Why did you crash on me? Wonderful, wonderful. Okay, let's try this again. Home/contact. There we go. Now let's try the different scenarios, make sure our validation is working okay. So let's just submit this first, and let's see what we get. We get error messages: name cannot be empty, is not a valid email address, and you must type a message. Now if we look at ViewSource, we're going to see that we have these input validation error classes. So once again, if we wanted to put those classes in a style sheet, we could do that. So let's type in something for name. Let's type in something for email, but let's make it not valid, and then some type of message. So if we submit this again, we can see that the error messages for name and message go away, but now we are being told that the value we have assigned here is not a valid email address. That's great. So let's make that an email address, and let's submit, and we get an error, and that's because in web.config I don't have that information set. So off screen I'm going to set that information, and then we will run it again and see that everything works. Okay, so I added that information, and before we go on, I want to point out that this error, well, even though we have an error, it's not related to the validation of the data. So we do not have that extra CSS class here, and of course we don't have the error messages. So those are only for data validation errors. Okay, so I am using Gmail, and that means I have to enable SSL. So we will add that here. That is a property, enable SSL, and your ISP may require that as well. Gmail does. So if you use Gmail, you will need to specify that. So let's run this again. And we will go to our contact form. Type in some information again. Yay, why did that happen? Okay, let's try this again. Alright, there we go. So our email got sent, and we got redirected to the get version of contact. As I press F5, you can see that we are not being prompted to resend those post variables. But notice that our success message is not listed there. So we need to do something different than view data, but this is pretty easy. We can do something called temp data. And this adds data to the session, and it's good for one request, which is pretty much all that we need here. So since we are using temp data, we need to go to our view and add temp data here. So we'll just copy, and instead of view data, we'll use temp data. So let's run this again. And home. So for the last time, let's enter this information, submit it. I knew that whenever I'd say the last time that would happen. Okay, so for maybe the last time, we will send this again, and yes, we will get redirected, and we have our success message here. And if we press F5 to refresh, then we lose that message, but at least we were able to tell them that their message was sent successfully. And so with that, we are done with this lesson. That is controllers and a lot of validation. Of course, with controllers, we found that in addition to having multiple action methods for different HTTP requests. We can also do things such as redirect to another action, and we also saw some of the helper methods like to return JSON and JavaScript and things like that. And as far as validation is concerned, we looked at how we can do some simple validation with model data binding and things like that. So anyway, thanks for watching. I hope you found it informational, and I will see you next time.